So I'm Michael Holliday, and I will be presenting on waste management and the law. First thing I'm going to be talking about is options for permanent disposal of nuclear waste. The first option is geologic disposal. This is placing waste deep underground in a geologic repository. The next option for permanent disposal of nuclear waste is subsea disposal. This is placing the waste beneath the seafloor where it not disperse into the ocean. The third option for disposal of nuclear waste would be disposal outside the biosphere. This would be placing it either in space or beneath the Earth's crust in the upper mantle. The fourth option is simply just putting it in polar ice sheets. And the final option would just be to leave the material at current storage sites. So the best option found for the permanent disposal of nuclear waste was to dispose of it in geologic repositories. And later in this presentation, I'll get more into that. Next thing I was going to talk about is the United States nuclear waste regime. This regime is a set of integrated laws, organizations, and agencies created to regulate and coordinate action for the disposal and management of radioactive waste. So next, we have the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982. This act was the first U.S. law to address high-level radioactive waste disposal. This act supports the use of deep geologic repositories for the safe disposal of radioactive waste. The act established procedures to evaluate and select sites for geologic repositories and for the interaction of state and federal governments. This act also assigned the Department of Energy the responsibility to site, build, and operate a deep geologic repository for the disposal of high-level waste and spent nuclear fuel. This geologic repository is Yucca Mountain, and I'll get to that later in this presentation. Next, I want to talk about the amendments to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. The first amendment added to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act directs the Department of Energy to consider Yucca Mountain as the primary site for the first geologic repository. The second amendment to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act prohibits the Department of Energy from conducting site-specific activities at a second site unless authorized by Congress. The third amendment requires the Secretary of Energy to develop a report on the need for a second repository no later than January 1st of 2010. And the final amendment to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act established a commission to study the need and feasibility of a monitored retrievable storage facility. Next, we have the Yucca Mountain program. This program started when Congress amended the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, directing the Department of Energy to study Yucca Mountain. After more than 2 decades of site studies, the Department of Energy filed a construction license application in 2008 for a repository at Yucca Mountain. Next, in 2010, the Department of Energy discontinued Yucca Mountain license review activities and impaneled a commission to recommend a new policy for the long-term management of used fuel and high-level radioactive waste. Then, the U.S. Court of Appeals for D.C. Circuit in 2013 ordered the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to resume its review of the Department of Energy license application. After all of that, in 2015, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission published the final volumes of its safety evaluation report. The final environmental impact statement and safety evaluation reports established that the proposed repository would be safe and environmentally sound. Now there are some possible issues. The first of which is at the Yucca Mountain site, there are possibilities for some water to enter and contact the waste containers. The next possible issue with the disposal of nuclear waste is with the environmental conditions at the Yucca Mountain site. The container materials may undergo various forms of corrosion. The conditions at Yucca Mountain are very hot and dry since it is in a desert. And going back to my last point, the types of corrosion include localized corrosion, stress corrosion cracking, environment-assisted cracking, including hydrogen-induced cracking, microbiologically influenced corrosion, and radiation-assisted corrosion. Next, I want to talk about some of the government liabilities. This is just an issue that the government faces with the disposal of nuclear waste. The Department of Energy was required by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 to begin removing used fuel from reactor sites by 1998. As of September 2015, the government's failure to do so has resulted in more than $5 billion in court-awarded damage settlements being paid from the taxpayer-funded Judgment Fund to compensate energy companies for storing the used fuel on site. Damages could reach more than $29 billion by 2022 and up to $500 million annually after 2022. So as you can see by this, they've already had to pay out a ton of damages for companies who have to store the fuel on site because the government hasn't found a way to dispose of it. And it's going to continue costing the government money until they figure out a way to dispose of it. Next, I have a picture. It's of the flow of high-level radioactive waste. So all of this starts at the nuclear power plant where recycling of uranium and plutonium occur. After this occurs, the spent fuel will then go to the reprocessing plant, where some of it can be recycled and used again for the recycling of uranium and plutonium. However, some of the high-level radioactive waste will go over to the Verified Waste Storage Center. This is where they store most of the waste until they can find a way to dispose of it. After it's been stored, and once they find a way to dispose of it, it will go over to the high-level radioactive waste disposal site. This next picture just kind of gives you an idea of where all the locations are of spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. So there are a lot of places that are storing high-level radioactive waste, and they just need to be able to dispose of it. So as you can see in the picture, the green dots represent commercial reactors. Most of these are located on the east side of the country. The X represents shut down reactors with spent nuclear fuel on site. The little pink star represents commercial spent nuclear fuel storage facilities. The blue triangle represents non-Department of Energy research reactors. The red square represents Navy reactor fuel. The upside down yellow triangle represents the Department of Energy owned spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. And then the open square, blue square, represents highly enriched uranium, and the upside down open red triangle represents excess plutonium. So just looking at this diagram, you can see we have a few of non-Department of Energy research reactors here in New Mexico. We also have some Department of Energy owned spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. This is up towards the northern part of the state. But other than that, most of the places where high-level radioactive waste is contained is on the eastern side of the country. This is my citations page. That's all I have for you guys on waste management and the law. I hope you learned a little bit about it, and thank you for watching.